Hey everyone, so looking back at 8,000 chapters of One Piece, there are so many small, unappreciated callbacks, references, and parallels that Oda has littered throughout the series, to the point that at any time you reread a given arc, you are probably going to find a connection, some small connection that you probably didn't notice before. And considering we are 1,000 chapters into the series, I wanted to go back through 13 small parallels you may have never realized before. But before we get started, make sure to subscribe for more content like this. So to start with, let's look back at the Straw Hats entering the Grand Line, and then later on the Straw Hats entering the New World. So these two scenes mirror each other in interesting ways. First and most obviously by the fact that to get into the Grand Line they have to go up and over a mountain, whereas to get to the New World they have to go down and then back up from the ocean floor. So one way is up and over, and the other way is down and under. But then on top of that, entering the Grand Line is marked by seeing Laboon as their first sight, a giant whale, which in itself is shocking for a little crew coming out of East Blue. But then upon entering the New World, on their way to the surface, they also come across an entire school of giant whales, which is a nice parallel for sure, but also just representative of how much the story has scaled up to the point that entering the New World is accompanied by the same sight as entering the Grand Line, but now just multiplied many times over. So their first sight of the Grand Line is Laboon, and their first sight of the New World is basically dozens of Laboons. And then even just small little throwbacks, such as Luffy talking about a mystery mountain as Nami explains their route to getting into the Grand Line. And then later on, Luffy talking about mystery currents as Nami talks about their route to getting into the New World. The next throwback that I really liked is Shanks' scene with Luffy in Chapter 1, has Shanks telling Luffy not to cry because men don't cry, after Luffy is broken up over Shanks losing an arm. Interestingly, after Luffy loses Ace, Shanks' advice is actually that it is okay and necessary for Luffy to cry. This seemingly contradicts Shanks' earlier statement, but if anything it goes to show that Shanks understands that there is a lot more you can lose than just an arm, as Luffy experienced at Marineford, and while Shanks was trying to lighten Luffy's guilt after the arm incident by saying men don't cry, in actuality, Shanks believes that learning to cry and grow is part of becoming a man. Number 3 is for the Zoro fans. I think most people believe that Zoro's counterpart on the Blackbeard Pirates is Shiryu. Going off that, an interesting parallel is in how Luffy and Blackbeard meet Zoro and Shiryu respectively. So both Zoro and Shiryu are being held captive when we first meet them. Luffy arrives and frees Zoro, and similarly, Blackbeard's arrival at Impel Down is what causes Shiryu to be freed. This next one I really like just because of what it means we could possibly expect from Koby in the future. Koby's first big moment is him standing up to Alvida despite being terrified, and speaking his mind against her. He is set to die, but comes to terms with the fact that he said what he wanted and doesn't regret it, and he is then rewarded by a stronger person, Luffy, stepping in and stopping the situation. Nearly 600 chapters later, Koby replicates this moment in a far more dramatic context, when he stands up to Akainu, despite being terrified, and speaks his mind to him. Koby is set to die, but comes to terms with the fact that he said what he wanted to, and doesn't regret it, and is then again rewarded by a stronger person, in this case Shanks, stepping in and stopping the situation. Both moments are also accompanied by his savior commenting that he did well. Next is the connection between Usopp and Noland. Now obviously this was played up in the story itself, in that the dwarves viewed Usopp as basically the second coming of Noland, and in the first place Nami once used the story of Noland the liar as a warning for Usopp. But for anyone who hasn't noticed the irony of their connection, I'll just mention it here. The story of Noland is that people thought he was a liar when he was actually a great hero, whereas in Dressrosa, we see the dwarves view Usopp as a great hero when he was actually a liar. Obviously Usopp becomes a hero by the end of the arc, but that was the funny part, that he was basically the reverse Noland at the start of the arc. And along those lines there are several points from Dressrosa. So, for example, we have Riku bowing his head to ask the citizens for help, despite that supposedly being completely taboo for a king. And then similarly, at the end of the arc, we have Fujitora bowing his head at the end to Riku, even though that is also supposedly completely taboo for an admiral of the world government. Also, both of those bowing moments are actually throwbacks to the Baroque Works saga. Luffy learns early on from Vivi that a good leader knows when to bow for help. At the end of the saga, Cobra shows that a good leader knows when to bow in thanks. So everyone already talks about the Baroque Works and Dressrosa parallels, and this one is just one that goes kind of under the radar. With Luffy and Riku, we see great men bowing for help towards the beginning of the storylines, and with Cobra and Fujitora, we see great men bowing for thanks and later on an apology at the end of their storylines. Basically, we get repeated examples in these sagas of characters not being so worried about their status or need for respect that they're afraid to bow their heads when it makes sense. Also, this nicely contrasts with Treble's claims to Doflamingo that a king should never fall to his knees, because of course kings like Doflamingo believe in enforcing their rule through power, whereas a king like Riku values humanity and kindness more. Speaking of Treble, a funny little parallel that maybe everyone noticed, but I don't know, is that there's a point where Treble is basically torturing the captured Tontatas and mocking them for the sounds they make in pain, which is Pigya. However, when Treble himself is defeated, he makes the sound Pigya as well. A few more from Dressrosa, probably because that's the most recent arc analysis I did, and I still had leftover notes. So Bellamy was an example of someone who worshipped an idol and put him on a pedestal. But interestingly, the Dressrosa arc also introduced Bartolomeo, who similarly worshipped an idol and put him on a pedestal, though in this case he's picked a much better idol. And whereas Bellamy would have died because his idol didn't care for him anymore, he was saved because of Bartolomeo's good nature, similar to Luffy, and this was actually the first step towards Bellamy shifting over from Doflamingo's side to Luffy's. Then we had the comical Luffy and Chinjao conflict over what Luffy's grandfather did, with Chinjao unreasonably holding the sins of Luffy's grandfather against him. However, while this was played for laughs, this was a reflection of the far more serious story of Rebecca, in which she had been living through all her life, being blamed and tormented for the sins of her grandfather by the people of Dressrosa. And lastly from Dressrosa, we got the reintroduction to Jesus Burgess, and I really like the fact that his reintroduction, the context of his reintroduction, was a callback to his first appearance in the story as an undefeated champion taking on all opponents. The Colosseum was just the absolute perfect way to bring him back in his element as a supposedly unbeatable champion who will take on all contenders. It's cool that Oda chose him as the representative of the Blackbeard Pirates in the Dressrosa arc, as it's a nice throwback to his roots. Beyond that, we have another Zoro parallel. At Arlong Park, Zoro fights Hachi, the 6-sword style swordsman, and later on in Fishman Island he fights Hyozo, the 10-sword style swordsman. However, what's interesting is that both of these fights are coming right off of recent Mihawk influence for Zoro. The Hachi fight is Zoro's first major fight after Zoro's big duel with Mihawk, and Zoro is actively thinking of Mihawk and how extraordinary he needs to be to defeat Mihawk while he's fighting Hachi. Then the Hyozo fight is Zoro's first major fight after Zoro's 2-year training with Mihawk, and here Zoro is now echoing the same things that Mihawk once said to him, referring to Hyozo as a frog in the well, reflecting the influence that Mihawk's training has had on him. So, 2 fights with Fishman Swordsman, both reflecting the influence of Mihawk at different points in Zoro's journey, the first time after a duel with Mihawk, the second time after training with Mihawk. Another parallel I like between early One Piece and post-time skip One Piece is them setting off from Logtown, and later on them setting off from Sabaody. Both times, everyone is ready to leave except for Luffy, Zoro, and Sanji, who are the last to arrive at the ship and are holding everyone up because they got caught up in fights. So both times, leaving for the Grand Line and leaving for the New World, it's the Monster Trio finally arriving together so that they can all set off. One last one from East Blue, and I think this one is really interesting, though it's hard to tell if it's intentional or not. Oda has said in the past that the story of One Piece was always going to be about taking down the 4 emperors. It's just that Oda ended up adding a lot of other stuff that padded out the middle. However, if Oda always had this idea of defeating 4 great pirates in mind and having Luffy become the king of the pirates, then if we go back to East Blue, what's interesting is that it's about Luffy defeating the 4 major pirates of East Blue: Buggy, Kuro, Krieg, and Arlong, and finally cementing himself as essentially the king of East Blue. So in a way, Luffy did the storyline of the New World in miniature at the start of his adventure. You can call it foreshadowing, you could say it's just a coincidence, I don't know, but I think it's interesting. And lastly, this is kind of just a funny, weird observation I had, but if you look at the Yonko top commanders, and you look at the characters that most consider to be, the second commanders of each Yonko, so Jozu, Queen, Lucky Roo, a common trend is that these second commanders are all kind of thick. Like, Jozu, Queen, and Lucky Roo are all basically the fat ones of each trio of commanders. Queen even introduces himself with a song about why he stays so big, and then on top of that, we have Smoothie, who is definitely thick in her own way too. So I think Oda definitely just thought it was funny to make all the second commanders the thick ones. So that's all for this video. If you enjoyed, then definitely like, comment, and subscribe, and you can support me on Patreon for my extended thoughts on all topics.